God, we thank you so much that we can come here and gather together today in your name. And we praise you because you are great. You are above all. And we ask that as we open your word today, that you would change our hearts, that you would change our minds, make us more like you, and that we would see that our strength is in you and in your greatness, no matter what happens. And God, again, we ask that you would draw us together in our hearts with a joined purpose to know you and to make you known. And we ask you would bless our time together as we continue to worship through the opening of your word. God, we pray all these things in your name. Amen. So this morning, we're going to be in the book of Habakkuk. And while you guys spend 5 minutes trying to figure out where that one is in your Bible, we're going to start off with a little bit of introduction just to biblical prophecy, where Habakkuk fits into that. There's not going to be any charts or timelines or anything, so you don't need to worry about that. But I want to give you a little bit of time to get there. And as we go through the sermon, it's going to be, the organization's a little bit different. We're going to do that little bit of intro about prophecy. We're going to talk about the book of Habakkuk. And I really tried hard to resist alliterating 3 points, but then Pastor Jeff just pulled me right back in. And in my heart, I couldn't forsake him and his ways. So we have 3 points that are alliterated in the book of Habakkuk. And then we're going to move to the New Testament and some personal application. But as we talk about just prophecy in itself, today we're going to be talking about Habakkuk, faith amidst the ruins, what it's like to live as a person of faith when everything is falling apart, right? But as we think about what prophecy even is, not how great thou art. You push the bottom one, not the top one. There's really 3 kinds of prophecy in the Bible. And when we think about prophecy, I think normally, everyone thinks about future telling. The prophet receiving some kind of specialized vision from God. But that's actually a minority of what happens in the Bible. When we look at the way that prophets behave in the Bible, there are 3 kinds. You could see them up there. The first one is forthtelling. Again, alliterated for you, Jeff. So forthtelling is when the prophet basically just knows God's word and he calls the people to follow it. So God says, don't worship idols. And so the prophet comes and says, hey, everyone, don't worship idols. It's really quite simple. In fact, some people will actually sometimes call preaching a form of prophecy because of that. All you're doing is you're speaking God's words that he's already spoken and encouraging people with that. And this actually, forthtelling, is probably the most common form of prophecy in the Bible. When we're reading what the prophets are saying, major prophets and minor prophets, this is usually what it is. And we're going to be talking about a minor prophet today, Habakkuk. They're only called minor prophets because the books are short, not because they're less important. So there's your extra for today as well. So don't think they're less important. The second thing is foretelling. Okay, so this is a little bit the same and a little bit different than the first one. And it is kind of like future telling, but only because you know how to take 2 and 2 and see that it's 4. So, for example, one of the main texts in the Old Testament is Deuteronomy 28. It's where God speaks to the nation of Israel and says, you're going to go into the land, and I want you to thrive. I want you to choose life and to do all of these things. But if you don't, here's the list of things that's going to happen to you. You know, there's going to be pestilence, and then eventually you're going to get taken out of the land into exile. And so all foretelling is again, taking God's words and saying to people, saying to the nation of Israel that if you don't forsake your idols, you're going to get taken away. You're going to have pestilence come on you. All of these bad things come on you. Again, it is a form of future telling because they're saying, you had better change or this is what God's going to do. But only in the sense that God already told them that this is what would happen. So that's foretelling. And then the last one is foreseeing. And this is one that we usually think of when we think of prophecy. And I think that this is probably the least amount of all of them. When you look at what actually happens in the prophets of the Bible, the first 2 make up the bulk, the majority of what the prophets actually do. They're calling people back by speaking God's own words. They're reminding people. But sometimes we get hung up on that last one, and that can be a little confusing, especially when we come to a book like Habakkuk, right? And so Habakkuk is an unusual one for a lot of reasons. I don't know about you, but I, for one, often think, I know that Jeff always, and I did this too today, the last song's going, He walks around over there, and you wonder, what is he doing back there? It's dark. You can't see. I picture him, like psyching himself up, getting ready. And, history is a lot like backstage, right? God does things, and we don't know why, right? A lot of times, I'm American, so the one that sticks out to me, September 11, when that happened, there was a whole line of people that were ready to say, this is why God did this, right? There was a bridge that collapsed in Minneapolis. There was a lot of people that said, this is why God did this. But the truth is, we don't know why God did it. We don't have something that tells us exactly why God did it. But the book of Habakkuk is really interesting because it is like, usually history is this big backstage, and it's kind of dark, and we don't really know what's going on. But Habakkuk is almost like a little flashlight, right? So God's shining back there in the backstage, and he's showing us, this is what I'm actually going to do, right? So it is a little bit different than some of the other prophets. The other thing that's unusual about Habakkuk is that he is not actually a prophet to the people, right? Usually prophets are from God to the people, but Habakkuk is opposite. He is basically a prophet from the people speaking to God. And so he's really unusual in a lot of ways. Before we even get to what he is actually saying, what he's actually doing, a little background to help us understand him. We don't know a lot about the guy Habakkuk. We think that maybe based on chapter 2, verse 1, it says, I will take my stand at the watchpost and station myself on the tower. That, maybe he could be a watchman on the city wall. And I kind of like that. This is sanctified imagination. I picture him, maybe it's the middle of the night, he's standing on the city walls at his watchpost, and he's talking to God and asking these questions. And we don't know that for sure, but it's an educated guess, right? So the other thing that we know about him, the dates are a little funny. We don't know exactly because we don't have a lot of information about him. But if we work out the things that he's preaching about and the things that he mentions from before, we can place him pretty good in a certain time of history. So your Old Testament history, the nation of Israel was taken away first by Assyria, and then the nation of Judah was left because the nation split into two separate nations. So there was kind of two Israels. So this is after the northern kingdom of Israel was taken away to Assyria, and Judah is still around, and they're still up to their old ways, and they're worshiping idols, they're doing all kinds of things. But from what we know about Habakkuk, it's really likely that when he was young, he grew up under the reign of King Josiah. He was a good king. If you read about the kings, he is probably one of the better ones. He tries to turn people back to God, to follow God's ways. But now, again, based on when he's speaking, what he's saying, it's really likely that he is probably under King Jehoiakim, who's a really, really bad king, okay? So he's actually, if you know your other Old Testament books, there's a part in Jeremiah where Jeremiah preaches to the king, and he sends a scroll, and he gets so mad, he just tears the scroll up and throws it into a fire, basically. That's this king, right? So he's a bad king. And with that context, I think it'll help us understand what he's going through. The thing that is interesting about Habakkuk, again, as I said, he's kind of backwards compared to the other prophets. He's going to tell us some things about the future. You get that flashlight shining on history, telling us what's going to happen, who's going to do it. But it's because he's asking questions of God, right? So he is called a prophet, actually twice in the book. The first one is right at the beginning of chapter 1, and then again at the beginning of chapter 3. He's called a prophet, but he's not usually the way that we think about a prophet, right? So I say Habakkuk is less a prophet than he is simply a man that has a lot of questions about the world, how God is working in the world, what he's doing, why he's doing it. And so in a lot of ways, when I read this book, it reads like, even though you have to cut through some of the things that are sometimes hard to understand in the Old Testament, a really modern book. Like, he has a lot of the same questions about what is going on in the world that I do, that a lot of us do. So we're going to end up reading a lot of the book of Habakkuk. We're going to skip over some parts and just kind of summarize them, but we'll get a good chunk of the book as we go through it. I want to give you an outline just so you can see where we're going before I get to the alliterated outline. But so the outline of, sorry, that's a little hard to read there on the side. Basically, the outline of the book goes, okay, God, why won't you do something? Things are bad. Why won't you fix it? And then God answers, this is how I'm going to fix it. And then Habakkuk says, but you don't fix it that way. Why would you fix it that way? And then God says, well, there's more to the plan than you maybe know. And I'm going to continue to do more things. And then chapter 3 is just kind of Habakkuk's response to that. So it's really a back and forth. So I want to start just by reading a couple verses. We're going to read chapter 1, verses 1 through 6, just to get into the book, and I'll do some explaining as we go along. But it says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise, so the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. So this is his first complaint. Remember this background that we have. He grew up under a good king, turning back to God. He's now under a king that is really bad, and basically everything in the nation is wrong. He's looking at God's law, and he's seeing that people are not doing this. And so his question is, there is so much wrong with the world. There's so much fighting. There's so much ungodliness. It seems like the evil people are winning. Why aren't you doing something? And he asks a question there. How long? And this is one of the most asked questions in the Bible. It occurs a lot of different times. Sometimes God asks it, where he's asking it of the nation, and it's kind of a question asked out of patience. How long will you follow after idols? But 24 times in the Bible, it's asked by people to God, right? So they say, how long, O Lord, until you do this, until you do that? The majority of them are in Job, which makes a lot of sense because Habakkuk's dealing with evil in the world, and why isn't God doing something about that now? Job is dealing with evil in his life and wondering what God is doing. It also occurs in Jeremiah. If you know about Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, that also makes a lot of sense. Same time as Habakkuk, probably. So he's seeing a lot of evil. And then we actually get one in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, which also makes a lot of sense as we're thinking about what's happening and the persecution that's happening at the end of all things. And the martyrs are saying, how long, O Lord, until you bring your justice to us, right? I say that's a question of faith because it doesn't say, God, you are powerless. God, you do nothing, and you're never going to do anything. But it asks, how long until you do something? I believe that you will do something. I believe that you have the power to change this, but I'm just wondering how long until you do something. And so it is a question of faith. And that brings us to this first point, complaining to God. Now, maybe we don't like to use the word complaining because Israel really got called out for that, complaining and grumbling and murmuring in the wilderness. But Habakkuk actually calls it his complaint as we get down lower. And there is nothing wrong with it. And in fact, one of the commentaries I read, he phrased it really well. He said, the problem with our complaining is that it goes in the wrong direction. We like to talk about God instead of talking to him. We like to complain about God instead of complaining to him, right? So Job does the same thing. He's asking this, how long? He's going through really severe suffering and asking, how long until you fix this? Now, Job, we do know, as we read later on in the book of Job, that he does actually accuse God. He takes it one step further and accuses God and says, you need to answer me because I don't know if I believe that you are good. And God does answer him, and Job actually repents of that at the end, right? But he asks the same question, how long? And he brings his complaint to God, but he's never actually called out by God. He's never censured by God for the complaints that he brings. In fact, I would argue at the end of the book when God is speaking through Job to Job's friends, he says, Job spoke rightly of me. That struggle was good. It was okay. And in fact, we look at the book of Psalms. If we look at 150 Psalms, 67 of them are lament Psalms. This is where so many of these how long questions come from. And the thing about this is, I sometimes think about it in context of human relationships because sometimes we'll separate, human relationships and relationship with God, which is fine. I think we should do that. But if my wife is down here, and I have a tendency to, if I have something that I'm upset about, to be passive aggressive, right? To not say anything, to just kind of be irked about it and really just hold it in until everything just kind of spews forth in anger, right? And I think we have the same tendency with God, right? To talk about God, to talk about why would he do this, why would he do that, instead of coming to God and saying, God, why are you doing this? And working that out with him. But Habakkuk brings that question to him. He comes and says, how long, O Lord, until you do something? So again, complaining to God is great. Complaining about God, not so great. But complaining to God is supported all over the Bible. It's encouraged, I would say. If we have something that we're wondering that is going on, that is tying us up in our hearts and in our lives, we should bring that to God. We should come to him honestly, and we should work that out with him. And that's what we see going on with Habakkuk here. And so he moves just from complaint to God to conversation with God. This is where we start to get the flashlight shining on history. So he says, God, just these general questions that we all have. God, why is this evil and all of this stuff, this strife and fighting, and all these things going on in the world about everything? Why is this happening? And God actually answers it, right? So we get a little flashlight, and he says, starting in chapter 1, verse 5, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. So basically he says the Chaldeans, what we know usually as Babylon, the nation that will come and bring Judah into captivity, they're going to come and they're going to solve this problem, right? And so he says they're evil, and then it actually has a little aside where it actually talks about how evil Babylon is, right? And God says a little bit more specifically what they do and how they take things that aren't theirs. And so this is where we get to kind of that second point in the outline of the entire book, where Habakkuk asks, well, why would you do it that way? I wanted you to do something, but God, I really don't appreciate you doing it that way, right? So he says, starting in verse 12 of chapter 1, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. So he says, I know we won't die, but so I trust you. It says, O Lord, you have ordained them as judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of pure eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. And this is the key part to what he says at the end. Habakkuk says, why do you look idly at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? And then he starts talking again about what Babylon does, Habakkuk does. But basically says, okay, God, I understand that you're going to use Babylon. You're going to bring them and use them to punish the nation, our nation, for our sins. But I don't understand why you would do that. Why would you do it that way? Because they're more wicked than we are, right? So again, if we're zooming this out to ourselves, broadly in the world, we're asking the same questions. We usually have the same question too, right? God, why is this happening? Why don't you do something? And then God does something. He said, well, that's not really what I was thinking. You could have done it a nicer way. You could have worked in my life in a way that was a little softer than that, and I would have appreciated that. And that's really what Habakkuk is saying here. He's saying, I don't think you should do it this way, God. And he continues. We're going to skip a little bit. He talks about how bad Babylon is. It says, then of Babylon, in verse 17 of chapter 1, is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Is Babylon going to keep on doing this stuff? Are they going to keep conquering nations like they conquer us? And then we get to chapter 2 that I mentioned before. It says, I will take my stand at my watchpost. I will station myself on the tower. I will look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Where he calls, again, this a complaint. He's having this conversation with God. Habakkuk asks a question, God answers. Habakkuk asks another question, God answers again. And this is where we're going to skip a little bit ahead, but it says a key verse we're going to talk about just a little bit, and then we're going to come back to it. It says, and the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on the tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Key verse of the entire book, I think, right here, Habakkuk 2:4. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. And some of you might have in your translations or even as a note, or by his faithfulness, right? So what's going on here? And why do I say this is the key verse in the entire book? Well, when we look at this and we're talking about conversation with God, God answers back, and this is what he says to Habakkuk, to summarize what we just read. This is going to happen. I want you to tell people, and people are going to respond in different ways, right? Some people are not going to like this. They're not going to believe it, but you need to tell them. And even if it seems like it's not going to happen, it will happen. And then he talks about these two different responses in chapter 2, verse 4. It says, so one person, his soul might be puffed up and not upright within him. That's going to be the one that's afraid. But the righteous will live by his faith. So we have trials coming, and God is saying there's two responses to this. A person who draws their strength from themselves, that they believe that they can withstand this or that they rest their foundation on themselves, but the righteous have nothing to fear. They live by faith or faithfulness. So we're going to come back to that concept in just a little bit. But remember that context, that this is in the context of huge trials coming, God's wrath being poured out on the nation, and then this is the response that people could possibly have, and he encourages the righteous live by faith. And we're going to see this lived out in Habakkuk in chapter 3. His response basically falls in line with that second half. The righteous will live by faith. Okay, so as we continue in chapter 2, this is where he explains more. So Habakkuk, remember, he asks, well, God, why don't you do something? God says, I am going to do something. I'm bringing the Babylonians. Habakkuk says, well, why would you use them? They're worse than we are. And then God says, well, there's more to the story. I'm also going to punish them. And this is where, I teach Old Testament. That's my job. And I sometimes have some trouble with sections of the Old Testament. And, they're a little hard to understand. If you're not jiving with what's going on, and this could be a little hard to understand, but basically, God calls down 5 woes. He says, these are 5 reasons that I'm going to judge Babylon. And the first 2 are kind of like different things that they're doing. Some of you are familiar with the Bible Project. When they summarize this, they say unjust economics. This is what people are doing. Basically, the rich are using their power to oppress the poor, and in 2 different ways. And that's 2 of the reasons why I'm calling out Babylon. The third one, that they are using slaves to build their empire, that they are treating human beings like just cattle and using them to build their machines and their war machines and their buildings and all of these things. The fourth woe, that they are bad leaders. They're leading badly. They're doing horrible things, leading people in transgression. And then the last one, that they worship idols. They follow after idols. And so this is why he calls Babylon out specifically. But I want to zero in on one, and probably a lot of you will realize why, because there's another really well-known verse. I know not a lot of people spend their free time reading the book of Habakkuk, and I understand that. But there are some verses that we know that get put on those nice little sunset verse of the day images and stuff. And this is one of them, and it's in chapter 2, verse 14. But we're going to take 13 before that. It says, behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. Right? You might know that verse. But what is the context of that verse? What is he actually saying? He's saying that nations are always trying to build their empires. Always. You can't trust nations. And this is me saying this right before U.S. Independence Day tomorrow. But nations are always trying to build their own little kingdoms. They're always trying to do things in their own strength, and it's always going to be that way. But ultimately, all those things are going to fall, right? They're always going to try and build things up. But what's that going to come to? Do we still talk about Babylon? I mean, obviously it's in the Bible, but if it wasn't in the Bible, how many people would really talk about Babylon anymore? Not too many. You could go to a history museum and probably see some stuff about it, but we're not talking about, Babylon, the great empire that's still spreading all over the earth, because it fell. Rome fell. All of these nations always fall, but the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will spread over the whole earth. So strength is not found in nations. Strength is found in God, right? And so I think he's using this to contrast with the people who live not by faith and the people that live by faith, right? Where do they put their power, their strength, their foundation? Is it in a nation? Is it in themselves? Or is it by living by God's strength, by his faithfulness, right? So I think, again, of an illustration. There's a story that goes around, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So there was a great king, Louis XIV, and he was known as the Great, right? And it goes that when he did his funeral, when he finally died, he was the guy. He often, I guess, was famous for saying, "I am the state." Like, I am this country. I have built this. He called himself the Great. And so he said when he died, what he wanted is he was to be taken to the cathedral, and they did this, and he wanted his casket in the middle and the whole room to be dark except for one candle, sitting on his casket, illuminating his casket to show how great he was, kind of like this little flashlight, sitting here. And the legend goes that the priest who did the funeral, he walked up slowly at the beginning of the funeral, and he leaned over, and he blew out and said, "Only God is great," right? And that's really what Habakkuk is saying, that this is not about what you can build, what you can do, what this nation does, how great it is, because all those things are going to fall, but God will endure forever. His strength will endure forever. So as we kind of move in a little closer to our final point, I want to go back to Habakkuk 2:4, because it is quoted in the New Testament 3 times. Okay? It is a popular verse to be quoted in the New Testament. And part of the reason I wanted to do this is to give us this context in the book of Habakkuk to understand what Habakkuk is saying so that we can understand how the authors of the New Testament are using this, what they're saying. And so it's used 3 times. The first one is in Romans 1:17. This is right at the beginning of the book of Romans, where Paul is basically saying the gospel is great, and we need to know the gospel. And then he says in Romans 1:17, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." Well, what's the context of this? He's talking about the gospel, those who believe in the gospel. What is the gospel? That God is great, that God is powerful for our salvation, and that man cannot earn his salvation on his own, but has to rely on God for it. Well, what comes right after this verse? It's talking about the wrath of God being poured out on humankind. Well, what's the context of the book of Habakkuk? The wrath of God coming on the nation of Israel, and people wondering, how should I live? Well, he says, the righteous live by faith. So this one's not too much of a problem when we're trying to figure out. It really fits the context of Habakkuk really well, and we understand it pretty easily. And the second one is in Galatians 3:11. Galatians 3:11, it says, "Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith." This one is a little more difficult to understand, because it might seem like when we're first reading this verse that maybe Paul is not understanding the context of Habakkuk, because what it seems like he might be saying is that, okay, it's not about living by faith, the actions of faith. It's about believing faith, because, the law can't save you. And I think that is a bad, big misunderstanding on our part if we separate that out. He is saying very clearly in the book of Galatians that you cannot justify yourself by following the law. But the context that he's using it here, I believe, is that we have problems, I think, in our minds, because in our modern time, we separate believing faith and acting faith, right? So we say, yes, salvation by faith alone, apart from works, the end. But I think that the Bible more clearly teaches salvation alone, by faith alone, apart from works, but transforming grace will produce works, right? And so there isn't really this separation between believing faith and acting faith. And so when we look at this verse in Galatians, and it says, no one's justified before the law, but the righteous will live by faith, it's not just saying believing faith. They don't separate that idea. He's saying that you can't be justified by the law, but if you live by faith, if you have believing faith, if you trust God in his strength, that will save you, right? And that will produce action. Okay, so that one, a little more difficult. But then one I think is the easiest for us is the last one. Hebrews 10:37-38. I actually want to turn there and give us a little bit of context there. If we read a couple verses before that, starting in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32, It says, "But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those who were so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. If she shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls." So in the book of Hebrews, it's actually talking about these trials that they're undergoing and the response to them. He says, you have confidence. Earlier on in the chapter, it says, you have confidence through the blood of Jesus to enter into the most holy place. Like, you can do this because you have the blood of Christ covering you. So don't lose confidence in the midst of your trials. Instead, the righteous shall live by faith. Well, that's exactly what Habakkuk said, right? Judgment is coming. Trials are coming. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. But if you live by faith and God's strength, you have nothing to fear. Don't shrink back. Don't lose your confidence. Persevere. Go on. And then right after that, if you're paying attention, comes Hebrews 11, the chapter of faith, right? And so it really just goes on and on about that. And at another time, a couple of years ago, I talked about this passage that it's not, sometimes we think of it as like heroes of the faith. But when you see what they're actually congratulated, held up for, it's more that they believe God's promises, right? It's not the power of their faith, but the power of the one they have faith in, that they are congratulated, held up as an example for us. Because the one that I always point out in that chapter that makes no sense if you think about the faithful life of them is Samson, right? Samson was a really terrible guy, and he's held up for his faith. Well, how could that be? His life was a mess. Samson is not someone we should try to act like, but he did rely on God's strength. He did rely on the power that God had given to him. And so his place in the book of Hebrews is not because he was a great guy, but because he believed and rested in a great God, right? So all of it fits together. So we get to, back to Habakkuk, finally. Understanding these, oops. Oh no, I did a bad thing and I lost my spot, and now I have to find Habakkuk again. So we get back to Habakkuk, and we understand this context, we understand all that's going on, and we get to chapter 3. And that brings us to, faithful belief and faithful actions cannot be separated, right? This is really what leads us into chapter 3 to understand Habakkuk's response. If we look at chapter 2, verse 4, what is it actually saying? Like, don't separate those two things in your mind. If you believe, you will act. Otherwise, you don't really believe, right? That's the test for us, if we believe something. Are we going to act on it? Are we going to allow that transforming grace to produce those actions in our life? And then come to Habakkuk in chapter 3, confidence in God. And this is a little, some people think Habakkuk might be a musician, maybe a Levite, because he writes this little song here. It says, starting in chapter 3, verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to a word I'm not going to try and pronounce, and I'm a Hebrew professor. Right? So it's a certain kind of song. It says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. And, goes on. But basically what Habakkuk does when he starts his poem, his expression of trust in God, he begins with God's power. And he waxes eloquent about all the things, God's great power. And there's another important verse in there where it says, in wrath, remember mercy, God. So this is the place where he is maybe playing again, the role of like Abraham in the book of Genesis, where God's pouring down wrath, and he says, but no, God, you are full of justice, you are great, you are good. In your wrath, which we deserve, still remember mercy. But he emphasizes God's strength in all of these things. He knows that God will bring about these things that he said that he would. But he emphasizes God's strength, which is so important as we get to verse 16 in chapter 3. It says, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound, and rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. So he admits, okay, and I think this is really important, we can't miss that part, that he is terrified about what's going to happen. This is not just, oh yeah, God is good. Place a smile on your face and everything's good and don't worry about it. Like, he's really, really scared about what's going to happen. But then, again, kind of the key ending of the entire book, it says, starting verse 17, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master. So the thing about this ending part is, again, there's a gap in history between us and Habakkuk. So maybe this doesn't speak to us quite so much. But for us, I think obviously we're coming through COVID time. If you guys were in Chiang Mai for a while, it was really tough to buy bread about a year and a half ago. The bread factory, there was a COVID outbreak and they stopped producing it. You go to 7-Eleven, no bread. You go here, Metro has no bread. Everyone's buying out the bread. You're in America, maybe it was toilet paper or other things. And so this is what Habakkuk's saying. He's like, so though you go to the grocery store and there's no food on the shelves, though there be no toilet paper, which is, though there be no bread, though the cars are bombed out, though the streets be empty of tourists, all of these things, he's looking around. And this is a worst-case scenario for him. The nation is burning, and everything has fallen apart around him. But he still expresses trust in God. He says, again, what does he say? God, the Lord, is my strength, right? What we've been saying. He is the person that God talks about in chapter 2, verse 4. The righteous shall live by faith. Where does that faith rest? In the strength of God. How can you have faith amidst the ruins of COVID or your life or all of this stuff? Only in the strength of God, not in the strength of yourself or anything. So let's get personal here. Like we've been talking big picture. Obviously, we've come through we're in COVID, we're through COVID. We don't know where we are with COVID. But we all have been through something in the entire world that we never expected to, right? Like it was hard. For people. For most people, like everyone is affected in some way. Okay, so where is your strength in that? What is happening? But I don't think we need to just stay at like the world or the nation level. This is personal for Habakkuk. He said, I hear and I tremble because I am not just the nation of Israel. I am Habakkuk. I am a person, and something is going to happen to me. Maybe my family will die. Maybe this could happen to my friends, or that could happen to my friends. Jeff asked me before if I was going to talk about my journey with cancer, and I said just a little bit because I don't want to make this like Greg's cancer sermon. But this is personal for me because when some of you know, this was back right at the beginning of COVID. I was diagnosed with cancer, had surgery, and everything was fine. And then in October of last year, it came back, and I went through chemotherapy. Is that what I wanted to happen? Absolutely not, right? No one wants that. Was it uncertain? Were we worried? Yeah, of course. Everyone is worried when things like that happen. But how can you have strength in that? And I'm not even saying that I had this great strength or anything like that. But God is our strength. He is our foundation. Even when you say, God, I don't understand why you caused this to happen to me, to my family. And I wish that you wouldn't do it this way, right? Just like Habakkuk said, but on a personal level. Still, even in that whiny complaininess that I, and I'm sure all of you know the same feeling, that we can have when God works in our lives through trials. He is still our strength, and he can take that complaining. He can take that whining. He doesn't need anything. We need that honesty with God, right? To say, look, I don't want this. I didn't want this. I don't want it in the future. I wish you would do it another way. But God, you are my strength in all of this. So for you, maybe it's something like financial. Maybe you're going through something and you just don't know how to handle it. You don't know what to do. Maybe it's you're dealing with people at home that, like, I can make enemies on both sides of the aisle. Like, maybe someone in your family is really for masks or really against masks, or, and you feel a different way. Like, there's always going to be someone in your life that annoys you and irritates you, right? It's just what life is, right? And in that, in those disagreements, those minor struggles, it's not just the big things, Like, sometimes you just wake up in the morning and you don't want to wake up, right? And I'm not saying that's the biggest thing in the world, but that is a trial in some sense, because you're getting old, you're dying. You are subject to the fall, because we are all falling apart because of sin, right? Bring that to God. Don't just say, man, I really want to go back to bed today, but bring it to God and say, God, give me strength. Be my strength, even in the small things, so I don't snap at my kids, so I don't take it out on someone else, right? This is not just the big picture, world, nation stuff. This is the small little parts of our hearts that this filters into. It's not just when the nation is burning. It's when our own hearts inside are dealing with struggle. That's what the righteousness through faith looks like. It's not just, hey, something big happened in my life and I handled it pretty well. It's also, don't be a bonehead to your family all the time, right? That's what righteous living by faith looks like. And when I think about this, there's a quote that I really love. My wife knows I use it. I try and work it into every sermon. I'm actually, I don't know, famous. In almost every youth lesson, I use a quote from C.S. Lewis. Just always work it in. This is not a quote from C.S. Lewis, but my wife knows I use this quote in almost every sermon I preach because it's so good. In the background of it is it's Martin Luther. He's writing to a really close family friend named Jerome Weller. He was like a tutor to Martin Luther's kids. He knows him really well, but Jerome was going through a really intense period of depression and was just asking for advice on how to live, what to do. How can I get through this? And I think his answer is useful for us. It's not exactly what we're talking about, but it is, I think, really helpful for us. It says, when the devil throws our sins up at us and declares we deserve death and hell, we ought to speak thus. I admit that I deserve death and hell. What of it? Does this mean that I shall be sentenced to eternal damnation? By no means. For I know one who suffered and made a satisfaction in my behalf. His name is Jesus, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Where he is, there I shall be also. So this is the answer to that. We bring it to New Testament belief. Where are we today as a church? Well, what happens when depression comes, when COVID really stings, when finances are bad, or this? Like, what can you do? Like, he's talking about his sins being thrown up in him and causing depression, but that's the answer for everything. Well, what happens when the cancer comes back? Well, there is where Jesus is, and where he is, I'm going to be there, because he is my strength. What happens when you have no money? Jesus is there, and he is my strength. What happens when you have to suddenly move back to your home country and you want to stay here? Jesus is there. He is your strength. That's where I will be also. That is where we find our strength. That is what Habakkuk is talking about, what God is saying when he says the righteous will live by faith. They are people who do not find strength in themselves, like working up, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, but see that God's strength, his grace, his transforming power is the only thing that they can cling to. And they live by that. That is the message of Habakkuk, even in the midst of the ruins of life, whatever that may be. And you know what? I've been a human long enough to know we screw up pretty much everything, right? So whatever it is in your life that is not right, God is still there in that, right? We can cling to him. There Jesus is. We can run to him. I'm going to be there because he is my strength, my hope, my salvation. That transforming grace, we ask God to work it in our lives so that we can know him better, make him known. A passage from Corinthians, I think it says, we have this treasure in jars of clay, like things that don't look good. We don't look good. Why is that treasure in jars of clay? To show that the power is from God, not from us. So we are not perfect people. We really don't look good, and a lot of times we mess up. And that's okay, because we don't want people to look at us and say, what a great person. He must be so strong. She must be so strong to do this, to do that. But to show that the power is from God and not from us. That people all around the world, in the nations, will see God and run to him because he is their strength and their salvation. So I'm going to close this in prayer, and then if the worship team wants to come up to close this in song, that would be great. God, thank you again so much for all that you are, all that you've done. We thank you for your transforming grace, for your power at work in the world, at work in our lives. And God, we ask that we would cling to you. We know that no one can escape trial. No one can escape the things that are happening in the world pertaining to COVID or whatever it is, whether it's wars, family trouble. But we know that you are in all of this. We can bring our questions, our thoughts, our complaints to you. And even if it's maybe not the way that we would do it, that we don't understand why you are doing it that way, we can draw our strength from you because, God, you created the heavens and the earth. You are powerful. We know that your glory will fill the whole earth. At the end of all things, it fills even now, but you will bring all things under your feet because you are King and you are God, and we can trust you, even when it's hard. And we know that sometimes it is hard. We ask that we would seek you out, Jesus, that where you are, that's where we would be too, as we seek to know you more, to make you known, to show that the power is from you, not from us. We ask that you would work in these jars of clay, even amidst trial, amidst the mess-ups of all the things, the ruins of our lives, that you would work and show that you are powerful and that you are good and that you are faithful. We pray all these things in your name, Jesus. Amen.